Hi students, here we are on another snow day. So in order to keep pace with everything, we are going to go ahead as scheduled and have the test tomorrow on motivation, emotion, and stress. Today in class, we'd really just be going through the review together. So I'm going to do that with you right now. Please, if you have any questions, send me a Teams message or shoot me an email. I can clarify anything that you might have a question on. Okay, so let's start with theories of motivation. The first one is the drive reduction. And remember, we're talking about basic motivation here. The motivation to satisfy basic needs and return the body to homeostasis. The tensions decrease when those needs are met. So basically, the drive reduction is as basic as you can get. You want to satisfy the needs of, sleep, food, water, shelter. And then when you do, then that tension decreases, and it really doesn't go any further than that. So we're talking like primary drives, like those basic needs, and those needs must be met before the secondary needs can be attended to. And we talked about that earlier in the learning chapter when we talked about those drives before. Secondary drives are things like money and esteem. Those are learned drives after the physiological needs are satisfied. Remember, we talked about kind of reinforced drives. And the point of the drive reduction, really, for both the primary and the secondary, I guess maybe I should put homeostasis under the primary, because we want to return our body to a balanced internal state. So the idea of drive reduction theory is always to satisfy those basic needs to return our body to the internal balanced state known as homeostasis. Then there's the optimal arousal theory of motivation. This says that motivation may increase or decrease arousal, but peak arousal is necessary for performance. So motivation can increase or decrease your arousal, but you want to have just the right amount, just the perfect optimum amount. And you can see that chart right there. If you're bored, you don't have enough, your arousal is too low, and that actually diminishes your performance. But if it's high, if you are too anxious, your performance will also suffer. So you want to have just the right amount. So the optimal arousal theory works on what's known as the Yerkes-Dodson law. It says that performance increases to a point and then it decreases. So what is going to motivate you to get to that optimum level? Do you need to have more arousal or less arousal to get to that perfect kind of optimum amount? And we go on to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow talked about how these levels of needs must be met before moving on to the next higher level needs. So each basic level has to be met before the next one can be achieved. So first is the physiological needs like food, water, shelter, sleep. Then the safety needs, feeling safe, bodily safety. Then love and belongingness needs. Then esteem needs, whether that comes from others or even your own self-esteem. And then self-actualization needs, that kind of highest level. And remember, Maslow is a humanist. So humanists are always going to say it's the individual, it's you being the best version of yourself and reaching your highest level. And one day, Maslow said, we will all get to that self-actualization point. All right, so let's move to motivation for hunger. What I want you to understand is hunger is both physiological and psychological. Now, if we think about drive reduction, if we think about Maslow, it seems like hunger is both physiological. And in fact, you remember the guy Walter Cannon thought that too until he did that experiment. And we know that hunger is also, while it's quite physiological, it's also psychological. And part of that hunger comes from the motivation in the brain, the hypothalamus especially. comes and is triggered by those neurotransmitters like dopamine. Think about you're hungry for a certain thing, you're craving a certain thing, and then you eat it, you have a bowl of ice cream or a piece of pizza or whatever it is, and then you're like, oh, I feel so, that makes me feel happier. So the hypothalamus might have a larger effect on eating than even the stomach does. That's what Walter Cannon showed. The set point theory for eating, that, or I should maybe even say hunger. The set point theory says that each individual, we all have our own individual weight thermostat of our natural body weight. And our body is going to work with its own natural metabolism to maintain that weight. And when we fall below a weight, our body is going to signal to our brain, hey, you need to start slowing down your metabolism to conserve some of the energy that you are trying to burn off, because I want to survive. The body is meant to survive. And so set point theory says that every person has their own kind of individual weight thermostat, and our body will really work to maintain that. Unfortunately, in America, we suffer with a lot of people suffer with eating disorders. We know that in the United States, we have more eating disorders on both ends of the spectrum than most other nations probably combined, for many different factors. Anorexia, bulimia, obesity. We have high numbers, relatively high numbers of all of those types of eating disorders. Let's talk specifically about anorexia. Anorexia nervosa is the fear of becoming obese and having this distorted body image. It happens especially in young women, but it's especially in young women not because they don't like food or they don't want to eat. It's usually about some aspect of control. It's usually a kind of a perfectionism or feelings of inadequacy. And so it's more about what they can control. And for people who suffer with anorexia, they feel like they can control their food intake. But it's really not about the food. It's typically about psychologically about something else. So if you think about that motivation for hunger again, it is physiological, but it's also very psychological. Do know that when we talk about BMI, the body mass index, this is a number, and numbers, could be not exactly accurate, but we have to start somewhere. When we in America talk about high numbers of obesity, we're talking people who have a BMI over 30. 20 up to 25 is a normal body weight. Overweight is 25 and over. 30 is obese. However, on the other side of the spectrum, under 18 BMI is considered to be underweight, and as you get lower and lower, it's pointing to more factors of anorexia. IO psychology. IO psychology stands for industrial organizational psychology, and this is workplace psychology. This is how people help companies, businesses, workers, employers, and employees make the best workplace environment. We know that people feel motivated when they feel like they're respected, when they're valued, when they're equal. So for instance, somebody in a human resources is going to see like, how can we give incentive to our employees the best? How can we help people be most efficient in their job? And when you make employees feel like they're respected, valued, and equal, workplace psychology actually improves. Locus of control. Locus of control we've also talked about before, but it's when we look at the outcomes in our environment that are motivated by either external factors or internal factors. So sometimes those external factors are called extrinsic factors. Those extrinsic factors are out of our control. It comes from beyond, and it's not really anything we can do to change. However, if we have internal motivation and we have a high intrinsic locus of control, we feel like there are factors that are within our control and they come from what comes from ourselves. So typically, those are both working in tandem. But if you feel like you just don't, like you can do what you can, but you can't control it, that's a typical external or extrinsic locus of control. However, an intrinsic locus of control, you feel like you're in command, you are in control, and you decide on your own destiny, not anybody else. Okay, theories of emotion. Here we go. So these are the three I really want you to focus on. I know there are a few more. These are the ones that I really want you to understand. The James Lange theory says that the physiological response comes first, then the emotional response. So I want you to remember in James Lange that emotion happens because of the physical arousal. So you feel your heart pumping, and then you feel your heart pumping, and then you feel fear because your heart is pumping. So think of James Lange as jump, then label. So there's no thought process that goes into this. You have the physiological response first, then the emotional response. Cannon-Bard, this is, remember it like cannonballs explode and do damage at the same time. The physiological response and emotion happens at the same time. They're simultaneous but separate. So Cannon-Bard said that those two things, like your physiological response and your emotional response, are going to happen at the same time, but they are definitely two separate things. You're going to jump back and you're going to feel fear at the same time. Schachter Singer is probably a better understanding because we're human beings. Schachter Singer is probably a better understanding of theories of emotion that kind of take the two, James Lange and Cannon-Bard, at least James Lange, to the next level. This is all about the two-factor, and you see I underlined the large C in the two-factor because it's the cognitive appraisal that's important. You make a cognitive appraisal of the situation. You label your arousal based on the experience of emotion. If you are at an event where it's a lot of excitement and maybe the game is on the line or something, you are labeling the arousal that you feel as excitement. But if you are at a place where it's maybe fearful, you're going to label that arousal as fear, even though the physiological response might be the same in both. The cognitive appraisal is what is important. You label those feelings, those experiences of your emotion, based on what you're doing and where you are and why you're feeling that. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, again, please send me a message. Maybe we could do a quick Teams chat or whatever it might be. The facial feedback system. Now remember, this is Paul Ekman, and Paul Ekman had talked about how, he had the 7 theories of emotion. All humans have the basic 7 emotions that we can tell. Now there is some difference culturally, but overall there's about 7 basic emotions. And he talked about that facial feedback system that we can produce changes. Our face can produce changes in our emotional feelings. Meaning, if we walk around with our shoulders sag and a really sad look on our face, we tend to feel sad. If we walk around with a smile on our face, we tend to feel happy. Now, chances are you're not walking around looking in the mirror, but the facial feedback system says that when you smile more, you feel happier. When you frown more, you feel more sad. And think about, the little cartoon test I did with the pencil between your teeth or above your lip, whether you were frowning or whether you were smiling. The stress response system, this is Hans Seil. He talks about these phases of stress. The stress response cycle sometimes is called. What we know is known as GAS, general adaptation syndrome. The first stage of GAS is alarm. It's when our sympathetic system is going up, it's increasing. Typically it's things like higher blood pressure, higher pulse, things like that. So even at a resting state, you have a higher pulse. And then if it's not something that is acute, and we'll talk about acute here in a second, if it's not something that's acute, your sympathetic system actually kind of stays on a higher level, and you go into this phase of resistance. Now, resistance means our bodies are just going to keep resisting and resisting and resisting and keep living with an increased sympathetic amount system. But we know we cannot maintain this high level of increased arousal for a long time, because finally the general adaptation system says that we reach the stage of exhaustion, where our body just gives out. It uses up all its reserved energy, all of its reserved stress response hormones, and we just give out. It often first results in illness, and this is when we see people, like, they get sick and then they get better, and then they get sick and they get better, and they get sick and they get better, because they just have not given their body enough rest. So exhaustion is when our body uses up all its reserves. It often results in illness, sometimes things like collapse and you have to be hospitalized. At the very worst, like death. And that's when we would see a body that is under a significant amount of resistance, goes through a high period of intense stress, and there's a stroke or a heart attack that could happen. And then finally, stressors. Stressors are categorized into three kind of different ways. The first are catastrophes. These are things that are really, really, they need your attention, and you have to direct all your energy and focus there. Catastrophes are usually acute, which means they have to be dealt with right then and there. Significant life changes, they can be acute or chronic, but do understand that significant life changes could be good or bad, but they are significant. Like, it's a big deal, but they're stressful. And then the daily hassles. And hassles are those little things that happen in life every single day that really contribute to your stress, although you might not think of it like that. You might not think that, not finding a parking spot, or, not being able to open the jar of pickles, or just all, like, any little thing that's a hassle. We don't think about it as something that contributes to our overall stress, but probably I would say those are some of the types of things that contribute more than others. Your daily homework grind, that's a significant hassle that it contributes to your overall stress level. And then the appraisal of stressors. We have the approach, what's the word I'm looking for? Approach style, maybe. So when you have two desirable options, so there's two things that you like or you want, but you have to make the choice between the two, and that's a hard choice. The approach of avoidance appraisal of a stressor is that there's one desirable thing, but choosing that will bring about one undesirable thing. And then you have to decide, is it worth it? So for instance, you want to stay out late with your friends because you're having a really great time, but that's going to get you in trouble when you come home because you broke curfew or whatever it happens to be. Are you willing to do it? So one desirable thing brings about one undesirable thing. That's the approach avoidance. And then the avoidance is when there are two undesirable options and yet you have to choose between the two. Like two things that you really don't want to do or engage in, or probably even stressors, but you have to choose between the two. Okay, so that's it. There are 25 multiple choice on this test tomorrow, one FRQ with 6 points. Be ready for a few old terms in that FRQ being thrown at you. Actually, a couple questions from previous chapters in the multiple choice as well. So give me a holler if you have any questions. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Bye.